Trust the government in terms of that which you cannot see. Declassified transcripts released from 1978 to 1980 show scientists knew as early as 1947, scientists knew that fission products released by atomic bomb tests could be deadly to humans and animals exposed during and after those tests. The Atomic Energy Commission chose to ignore warnings from their own scientists, their own medical researchers, because of their blind faith in their ideology. And so, because of their particular ideology, they felt that they could justify the intentional lie. I think the Atomic Energy Commission was obviously delusional in their moral thinking. Former Utah Governor Scott Matheson recalled the era of those early Nevada above-ground testing when he said, this is now a quote from former Governor Matheson, "People in southern Utah were mainly concerned with making a living. And I don't recall anyone being too upset about the brilliant flashes and thunder-like blasts that were part of the 1953 atomic testing. The Upshot Knot Hole series, conducted from March to June 1953, included the Dirty Harry exposure that carried an enormous amount of debris downwind over southern Utah. People were concerned about the sheep deaths that occurred in May 1953. But when the Atomic Energy Commission said there was nothing to worry about, we all shrugged our shoulders." Now, no one really accepted the malnutrition rationale, but we were used to accepting whatever the government said, especially during that very nationalistic period. So during that testing period in 1953, 18,000 to 20,000 sheep were exposed to radioactive fallout. There were burns on the faces and lips where the sheep came in contact with the grass. Ewes began miscarrying in large numbers. Wool was falling off the sheep in large clumps. New lambs were stillborn with grotesque deformities or born so weak that they were unable to nurse. Ranchers lost about a third of their sheep. Somehow it didn't add up to the explanation that it was malnutrition. It didn't quite compute. 1955 and 1956, lawsuits were brought by Iron County ranchers against the government, alleging that those nuclear tests in 1953 had damaged their herd. Government veterinarians collected technical data on radiation damage, but none of that material was permissible evidence in the court of Judge Sherman Christensen in 1956. Although the judge held the government negligent in not properly monitoring the tests, he ruled it could not be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the damage to the sheep occurred directly as a result of atomic testing. So that was 1956. 1979, through congressional oversight hearings and new evidence produced, the same judge, Sherman Christensen, reopened the suit. This time, the new information revealed the Atomic Energy Commission's deceptions, and in his 56-page decision ruled that a, quote, species of fraud had been committed upon the court by government lawyers and federal employees who acted intentionally false or deceptive. So here we return to our initial criteria for what is moral or not. It's not sufficient that information was just wrong, but that it was intentionally deceptive. Nevertheless, The government, our government, appealed the decision, and the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals rejected Judge Christensen's ruling, maintaining that the material from the congressional hearings was not admissible under the rules of federal procedure. 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal of the Circuit Court's decision. Now, you're probably wondering as well as I, what about the people? I mean, sheep are one thing. That was hard enough. What about the people? What about the citizens of Iron County who were exposed to nuclear tests? Well, within 3 to 5 years after the atmospheric testing, leukemia and other radiation-caused cancers appeared in the people. Neighborhoods in which childhood leukemia was rare or unknown suddenly had clusters of cases in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In the 1990s, people in Iron County believed they were themselves victims, like the sheep, and adopted the name Downwinders. Do you know that nuclear tests were only detonated when the prevailing winds were east or northeast, thereby avoiding Las Vegas and the large metro areas in California? Southern Utah was in what was referred to as the fallout arc, bringing an epidemic of cancer to the area. Test site workers, military servicemen forced to watch the tests, Downwinders, filed lawsuits. 24 plaintiffs in one case represented 1,200 individuals who were deceased or living with leukemia, cancer, and other radiation-caused illnesses. Judge Bruce Jenkins issued a landmark decision that awarded damages to some of the victims. And guess what happened? The government appealed, and once again, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Jenkins' judgment. The Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal. The barrier to providing some small sense of restitution, some sense of justice to the victims, what prevented that from happening was the claim that it was impossible to connect health effects definitively to low-level radiation exposure. And the courts ruled that compensation would have to come through legislation. 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which created a $100 million trust fund to compensate the Downwinders. The legislation states in part, and this is really pretty interesting, the United States should recognize and assume responsibility for the harm done to these individuals and recognize that the lives and health of innocent individuals who lived downwind from the Nevada test were involuntarily subjected to increased risk of injury and disease to serve the national security interests of the United States. The Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation to the individuals and their families for the hardships they may have endured. That's an interesting apology, wouldn't you say? The damage was unleashed as innocent people served national security interests of the United States. And so it was the nation apologizing to them, not for any deception, but apologizing that somehow they got in harm's way. I'm sorry that happened. 61 years after that first nuclear explosion at the Nevada test site, we still don't seem to get it. The Soviet Union, our Satan during the Cold War, collapsed in 1991. Our nuclear arsenal remains bloated, disconnected from any geopolitical reality. We don't need thousands of warheads to counter threats from Iran or North Korea. China has fewer than 400 warheads. Pakistan has roughly 100. North Korea, less than 10. Tens of billions of dollars could be saved annually if we brought our nuclear arsenal to a more sensible level. I need not remind anyone how urgently we could use such funds. And Sam Nunn, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, they all agree that the government still insists that we need this kind of arsenal for national security interests. Are they lying? Does our nation cling to an ideology that must always perpetuate misleading statements they think for the greater good of us all? Does the Department of Defense have access to a truth, like a priest? Or is the rationale for actually furthering our nuclear developments, is that all delusional? More broadly, where has the distrust of government brought us today? Are we unraveling as a country not because we haven't maintained family values from the 50s, but because we were too trusting of government 60 years ago? Many of us have paid the price through the years of the decades in which our government's ethics somehow overlook the fact that truthfulness is not always essential to human society. Somehow that point has been missed. So today we commemorate Downwinders. Today we feel their anguish and their pain, their experience. But also today we mourn a little for ourselves and for all Americans who still wonder, would not our government try to protect our health? Wouldn't our government try to protect our safety? Wouldn't our government protect our well-being? We wonder. So be it.